The morning heat already shimmered off the tarmac when Dr. Eleanor Mitchell stepped onto forward operating base Horizon for the first time. At 38, she'd seen enough military installations to know the rhythm, the controlled chaos of helicopters spinning up, medics shouting over engine noise, and the unspoken hierarchy that governed every interaction. But today felt different. Today, she was the anomaly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her standard-issue medical coat bore no unit patches, no embroidered credentials, no insignia that would place her in the pecking order. Just her name tape and the dust that had already begun to coat her boots during the walk from the transport. She carried her medical bag under one arm, observing the choreographed dance of personnel moving between medical tents. "Ma'am, can I help you find the admin tent?" The voice cut through the turbine noise like a blade. Lieutenant Mason Briggs stood before her, tall and sunburned, his confidence as polished as his aviator sunglasses. Two other medical officers flanked him, their uniforms decorated with unit crests and morale patches that told stories of deployment rotations and successful missions. "Or are you here to double-check our medical charts?" he added, earning chuckles from his companions. Eleanor's expression remained neutral. She'd heard worse during her 15 years in military medicine, first as an army surgeon, then as a civilian contractor, and now in whatever gray area her current assignment occupied. She glanced once at Briggs, neither challenging nor cowed, then moved toward the medical station. A gust of wind lifted the edge of her gear pouch, revealing a corner of something the others couldn't quite see. A worn medical journal, the kind used before digital systems took over. It was filled with handwritten notes, calculations, and observations from surgeries that had taught her more about battlefield medicine than any manual ever could. "That's the one they're embedding with us," Briggs muttered to his crew as she walked away. "The clipboard doctor. Can't wait to have her triple-check our procedures for punctuation errors." The medical chief intercepted her near the triage area, squinting against the desert glare. "You're Mitchell. Central Command said you'd be handling medical logistics coordination, tracking supply inventories, medication logs, equipment entries." He handed her a clipboard and pointed toward a folding table beneath a portable shade unit. "Your station's over there." Eleanor took the assignment without comment and settled at the designated table. The clipboard was scuffed, the marker half dead, but she made it work as she began recording medical inventory numbers and supply schedules. She noticed something that made her pause. The medication calculations didn't match the inventory manifests. Nothing dramatic, just a few percentage points off. But in battlefield medicine, small discrepancies had a way of becoming big problems. She made a note in her personal journal, the one tucked against her hip where no one could see it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From across the tarmac, she could hear Briggs and his squad bragging about complex procedures and successful evacuations. Their laughter carried on the desert wind, punctuated by the occasional glance in her direction. She'd become the subject of their entertainment, the outsider who didn't belong. "Hey, Mitchell," one of the younger medics called out during the afternoon break. "What's your specialty?" She looked up from her paperwork, her voice steady and clear. "I don't discuss that." The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter that had come before. Briggs rolled his eyes and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Well, that's either confidence or delusion." As the day wound down and the medical station grew quiet, Eleanor remained at her station. She cross-referenced medication reports with treatment schedules, noting every discrepancy in her personal journal. When she finally packed up and walked across the medical tent floor, she passed the duty roster on the wall. Rows of medical personnel names with their specialties stenciled in bold letters. Her name wasn't there, but her journal pressed against her hip contained something more valuable than recognition: the truth about what was happening on this base. And truth, she'd learned over the years, had a way of surfacing when it mattered most. The desert wind picked up as she headed toward her quarters, carrying with it the sound of helicopters powering down and the distant echo of voices that no longer seemed quite so confident. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve, but tonight she reviewed her notes by lamplight, preparing for a fight she knew was coming. 3 days had passed since Eleanor's arrival, and her name still hadn't appeared on a single treatment roster. The assignment board in the medical briefing hall showed her listed under Logistics Coordination, a catch-all category for personnel who didn't quite fit anywhere else. She'd stopped checking after the second day, but others hadn't stopped commenting. "Clipboard back," muttered Specialist Danny Walsh as she entered the operations trailer. Guess the mission really needed more checkboxes. The shared smirk that followed was performative, designed to establish hierarchy rather than express genuine humor. Eleanor walked past them without acknowledgement, her attention focused on the wall map, displaying the day's patrol routes. She'd noticed something troubling the night before: a miscalculation in the evacuation flight path for the afternoon's training exercise. With the predicted threat assessments and the heavy casualty configuration they were planning, the medical evacuation team would be cutting response times dangerously thin. She'd run the numbers 3 times in her quarters, each calculation confirming her concerns. During the pre-exercise briefing, Lieutenant Briggs commanded the room with his usual theatrical confidence. He outlined the mission objectives with sweeping gestures, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. "Triple casualty evacuation from the canyon floor," he announced, pointing to the route marked on the map. "Tight formation, staged extractions. Estimated response window gives us 15 minutes of buffer time." He paused, scanning the room. "Stick to the plan. Maintain radio discipline, and remember, no improvising." From her position at the back of the room, Eleanor raised her hand slightly. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just enough to catch his attention. Briggs noticed, one eyebrow lifting in surprise. "Got something to add from dispatch?" His tone carried the practiced dismissiveness of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Your evacuation route might run short on the return leg," Eleanor said evenly. "If the enemy activity accelerates as forecasted, I'd recommend adjusting the extract point or planning a secondary fallback position at Point Echo." The room went quiet. Several medics exchanged glances, unsure whether to take her seriously or follow Briggs's lead. For a moment, something flickered across the lieutenant's face. Not anger, but calculation. He was deciding how to respond to this challenge to his authority. "Thanks, Mitchell," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll add that to the what-if file." He turned back to his squad, his voice deliberately brighter. "Anyone else want to run battlefield scenarios from behind a desk?" The chuckles that followed were more nervous than amused, but they served their purpose. Eleanor's warning had been heard, acknowledged, and publicly dismissed. She made a note in her journal and remained silent for the rest of the briefing. 2 hours later, the simulation launched with textbook precision. 3 medical teams deployed in staggered formation, their radios alive with clipped updates and professional banter. Eleanor sat in the communications bay, monitoring the telemetry feeds that tracked each team's position, response times, and system status. She wasn't technically assigned to monitor the exercise, but no one had told her not to. Her screen showed the formation approaching the canyon floor right on schedule, and seemingly without problems. Then, halfway through the extraction sequence, the warning she'd predicted began to manifest. The third team, Briggs's position, started showing delayed response times as enemy activity increased beyond the morning forecast. The medic began calling out extended extraction readings, his voice tight with growing concern. By the time they reached the secondary extraction point, the situation had become critical. Contact heavy, requesting immediate fallback vector, quote, came the radio call. The simulation cascaded into failure from there. The extraction team couldn't maintain formation, forcing the lead units to slow down and expose themselves to additional fire. One crew was declared lost when they couldn't reach the evacuation point. The exercise was terminated with only 1 successful pickup out of 3. As the medics filed out of their simulators, sweat-stained and frustrated, Briggs walked past Eleanor's monitoring station. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something harder, more defensive. "That's what happens when you fill people's heads with last-minute doubts," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "They start second-guessing the plan instead of executing it." Eleanor didn't respond. She saved her monitoring data, logged the discrepancies between predicted and actual response patterns, and quietly left the communications bay. Her journal now contained detailed records of not just what had gone wrong, but what could have been prevented. That evening in the mess hall, the atmosphere was subdued. The failed simulation had shaken the confidence of several junior medics, while the senior staff discussed lessons learned in hushed tones. Eleanor sat alone at a corner table, her meal barely touched as she reviewed her notes. She didn't see Specialist Jennifer Hayes approach until the young woman was standing directly beside her table. In her hand was a small plastic stethoscope, bright red, obviously from a child's toy doctor kit, with a strip of fluorescent medical tape wrapped around its shaft. "Might help next time," Hayes said with false sweetness, then pressed the toy firmly against Eleanor's tray. The insult was clear enough. If she couldn't work with the real medical team, maybe she'd have better luck with toys. A few nearby tables noticed the interaction, their conversations growing quieter as they watched for Eleanor's reaction. She set down her fork, looked once at the plastic stethoscope, then calmly stood and carried her tray to the return station. The toy fell to the floor with a small plastic clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. As she walked toward the exit, Eleanor could feel dozens of eyes following her movement. Some expressions showed curiosity, others discomfort at witnessing the public humiliation, but none showed support. That night, alone in her quarters, she opened her journal to a fresh page and began writing, not medication calculations or supply notes this time, but a detailed account of everything she'd observed since arriving at the base. The patterns of dismissal, the casual cruelty, the systematic exclusion from decision-making processes. She was building a record, though she wasn't sure yet what she'd do with it. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring new tests, new attempts to break her resolve, and she was determined to document every single one. By the end of her first week, Eleanor had become a ghost, haunting the edges of base operations. She completed her assigned logistics tasks with mechanical precision, submitted safety reports that were filed away unread, and endured the daily ritual of checking assignment boards that never included her name under medical operations. The harassment had evolved from crude jokes to more systematic exclusion. Someone had taped a new sign to her locker: "Medical privileges revoked," in the same bright yellow medical tape used to mark contaminated equipment. Her assessment reports were returned with "insufficient clearance" stamped across them in red ink, even when she'd identified legitimate safety concerns. But it was Corporal Marcus Torres who first noticed what the others had missed. Torres was younger than most of the medical staff, still soft around the edges, but sharp-eyed and methodical in his work. He'd been watching Eleanor's interactions with patients, noting the way she moved around the wounded with the unconscious competence of someone who'd spent years in operating rooms, not just logistics bays. "You used to be a surgeon, didn't you?" he asked quietly one afternoon as she inspected medical supplies on one of the emergency response kits. Eleanor paused, her flashlight beam steady on a package of hemostatic gauze. "Why do you ask? The way you check the surgical tools, test the clamp response, that's not how logistics people look at equipment." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "Plus, I found some of your old service records in the archived files. Major Eleanor Mitchell, 18th Combat Support Hospital, Bronze Star with Valor Device, 2 Army Commendation Medals." He studied her face. "So why are you here counting clipboards?" She straightened slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since their conversation began. "Because someone needs to be counting clipboards, especially when the people treating patients don't want to listen to safety concerns." That evening, the harassment escalated beyond passive-aggressive exclusion. Eleanor returned to her quarters to find her door propped open, and her personal belongings scattered across the floor. Her medical gear had been relocated to a supply closet, her journals mixed in with obsolete procedure manuals. The message was clear: she didn't belong here, and they were prepared to make her life increasingly miserable until she accepted that reality. But as she methodically reorganized her possessions, Eleanor found something that changed everything. Mixed in with her scattered papers was a document she'd never seen before. A base memorandum dated 2 weeks earlier, marked "Confidential Command Staff Only." The memo outlined a series of operational deficiencies that had been flagged by an unnamed medical safety audit. Multiple treatment protocols had failed to meet minimum standards, medication dispensing had been consistently problematic, several near-miss incidents had been inadequately documented. The memo concluded with a recommendation for immediate intervention by qualified oversight personnel. Eleanor read the document 3 times, her understanding crystallizing with each pass. She wasn't at Forward Operating Base Horizon as a logistics coordinator. She was there as an auditor, an undercover evaluator sent to assess the competence and safety standards of the medical operations. The realization reframed everything she'd experienced. The hostility wasn't just petty harassment, it was an attempt to neutralize a threat to their careers. Briggs and his crew somehow suspected or knew what she really represented, and they were trying to discredit her before she could complete her assessment. Late that night, she sat at her small desk and began typing a preliminary report on her laptop. She documented every safety violation she'd observed, every dismissed warning, every example of professional incompetence masquerading as confidence. The evidence was damning, but she needed more. She needed them to fail publicly, with consequences serious enough that dismissing her warnings would be impossible. The next morning brought news that would provide exactly that opportunity. A complex multi-casualty exercise was being planned, a simulation that would push the medical teams to their operational limits. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes scenario where small mistakes became catastrophic failures. As she reviewed the preliminary treatment plans, Eleanor identified at least 6 critical errors that would virtually guarantee mission failure. But this time, she wouldn't just submit written warnings that could be ignored. This time, she would let them fail spectacularly, document every mistake, and ensure that the consequences reached the attention of people who couldn't be intimidated or dismissed. The game was about to change, and she was finally ready to play by her own rules. During the pre-briefing for the complex multi-casualty exercise, Lieutenant Briggs displayed his usual swagger as he outlined the mission parameters: multiple casualties, hostile territory, tight time constraints. Exactly the kind of scenario that separated competent medical personnel from those who relied more on attitude than ability. 3-phase triage protocol in a hot zone, Briggs announced, his pointer tracing routes across the tactical display. We'll be running minimal supplies to maximize mobility with staged resupply at checkpoint Delta. He paused, scanning the room with practiced authority. Weather looks favorable, infiltration routes are stable, and intelligence indicates moderate hostile activity. From her position at the back of the briefing room, Eleanor recognized at least 4 critical miscalculations in his plan. The intelligence data he was using was 18 hours old and didn't account for the increased enemy activity reported in the latest dispatches. His supply calculations assumed optimal conditions that rarely existed in reality. Most significantly, his staged resupply point was positioned in terrain that would be impossible to reach if the primary extraction ran long. She raised her hand. "Yes, Mitchell?" Briggs's tone carried the weary patience of someone humoring an unwelcome interruption. "The intelligence you're using is outdated," she said evenly. "Current reports show enemy activity building in the target zone. I'd recommend adjusting the approach vector and increasing medical supplies by at least 15%. The room went quiet. Several medics shifted uncomfortably, caught between their loyalty to Briggs and the nagging suspicion that she might be right. Briggs himself studied her for a long moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Appreciate the input from logistics," he said with deliberate emphasis on her supposed role. "But tactical planning is handled by qualified field personnel, not supply chain coordinators." He turned back to the display. "We stick to the approved plan. Any other questions?" No one else spoke. The briefing concluded with standard safety reminders and radio protocols, while Eleanor sat silently in the back row, making detailed notes in her journal. She wasn't just recording the plan's deficiencies anymore. She was documenting the systematic dismissal of safety concerns by senior personnel. As the medics filed out to prepare their equipment, Corporal Torres approached her station. "You're going to let them go through with this?" he asked quietly. "I'm going to let them hang themselves," she replied, not looking up from her notes. "Sometimes people need to fail before they're willing to learn." 3 hours later, the simulation commenced with characteristic bravado. 3 medical teams deployed in perfect formation, their radios crackling with professional chatter as they headed toward the training area. Eleanor monitored their progress from the communications center, watching telemetry data that told a story the medics hadn't yet realized they were writing. Within 20 minutes, the first signs of trouble appeared. The lead team reported unexpected enemy contact as hostile forces began moving into the area, exactly as Eleanor had predicted. Casualty numbers spiked as the simulation controllers introduced more injured personnel than the teams had prepared for. By the 30-minute mark, the tail team was broadcasting urgent requests for additional supplies. Critical shortages on hemostatic agents and plasma. Requesting immediate resupply, came the increasingly tense radio call from the 3rd Medical Team. The simulation began unraveling rapidly from there. The first team had to abandon its second triage run due to overwhelming casualty numbers. The second team experienced a security breach that may have been simulated or may have been real. In the chaos of the failing exercise, no one was sure. The third team declared an emergency withdrawal and limped back to base, with several simulated casualties left untreated in the field. Mission failure was total and public. Instead of treating simulated casualties, the exercise had created a situation where, had it been real, soldiers would have died unnecessarily. As the teams returned to base and the post-exercise debriefing began, Eleanor quietly compiled her report. She had documented not just the technical failures, but the decision-making process that had led to them. The dismissal of intelligence updates, the reliance on outdated information, the prioritization of mission confidence over operational competence. Most importantly, she had recorded the systematic exclusion of qualified input from personnel who didn't fit the established social hierarchy. Her recommendations hadn't been dismissed because they were wrong. They'd been dismissed because she was an outsider. That evening, as frustrated medics clustered in small groups discussing what had gone wrong, Eleanor transmitted her report through encrypted channels to Central Command. The document was comprehensive, devastating, and impossible to ignore. Within hours, she received a response that consisted of a single line: "Audit phase complete. Prepare for resolution protocol." The reckoning was about to begin. The failed simulation created a palpable shift in the base's atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter, glances more calculating, and the easy camaraderie that had defined Briggs and his circle began showing hairline cracks. But rather than promoting self-reflection, the failure seemed to harden their resolve against the outsider they blamed for introducing doubt into their operations. Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated. Her mealtimes were marked by empty chairs at neighboring tables, her equipment inspections were dismissed without review, and her safety reports disappeared into administrative black holes. The message was clear. She had crossed from irrelevant to actively unwelcome. But Corporal Torres wasn't the only one who had begun watching her with new interest. Captain Lisa Morrison, the base operations officer, had been quietly reviewing the failed simulation data when she noticed something that made her pause. The telemetry log showed that every catastrophic failure point had been precisely predicted in a series of reports filed by Mitchell over the previous week. Not general concerns, but specific technical warnings that had proved accurate down to the minute details. Morrison pulled Mitchell's personnel file and discovered the same discrepancies that Torres had found. The woman assigned to logistics coordination was a decorated combat surgeon with more field experience than most of the base's senior staff. Her transfer orders were signed by personnel so far up the command chain that Morrison didn't recognize half the names. Something was happening here that went far beyond personality conflicts and unit politics. Meanwhile, Eleanor was implementing the next phase of her audit protocol. Instead of continuing to submit warnings that would be ignored, she began creating situations that would force the base's operational deficiencies into the open. She started with something subtle but significant. During a routine medical inventory, she discovered expired blood products in one of the emergency response kits, the kind of defect that could cause catastrophic failure under stress. Instead of reporting it through normal channels where it might be dismissed or delayed, she quietly documented the issue and waited. 2 days later, those same kits were scheduled for a high-stress training mission involving rapid response to mass casualties, the kind of exercise that would turn a minor oversight into a major emergency. 30 minutes before deployment, Eleanor approached the medic assigned to the team. "Specialist Williams," she said quietly, "I need you to take another look at the blood products in Response Kit 77 Alpha." Williams looked up from his pre-deployment checklist, irritation flickering across his face. "Mitchell, I already completed the inspection. Everything's green." "I'm sure it is, but there's an expiration date problem on the plasma units that's going to fail if you use them today." She handed him a small LED flashlight. "Check the date stamps in the corner. They've cycled past expiration by 3 months." Something in her tone made him pause. Despite his initial resistance, Williams found himself following her direction, checking the dates exactly as she'd specified. The expired labels appeared clearly under the light, unmistakably dangerous if used on real patients. "Jesus," he muttered, examining the other units. "How did you spot this?" "Because I was looking for it," she replied simply. How long to replace the units? 30 minutes minimum, assuming we have stock available. Williams was already reaching for his radio to halt the deployment. Why didn't you report this through normal channels? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Would anyone have listened? The grounded medical team forced a reshuffling of training schedules and personnel assignments. Lieutenant Briggs, whose squad had been assigned to the affected deployment, found himself scrambling to maintain operational readiness with reduced resources. But more significantly, word began spreading among the medical staff that Mitchell had identified a potentially catastrophic failure that the standard inspection process had missed. That evening, Captain Morrison requested a private meeting with Eleanor in her office. The space was sparse but functional, decorated only with deployment photos and operational charts that reflected Morrison's no-nonsense approach to command. "Sit down, Mitchell," Morrison said, closing the door behind them. "We need to talk." Eleanor remained standing. "About what, ma'am?" "About who you really are and what you're doing on my base." Morrison moved to her desk and pulled out a thick file folder. "Your transfer orders are signed by people I've never heard of. Your personnel file contains gaps that don't make sense. And you just prevented what could have been a fatal medical error using inspection techniques that aren't taught in logistics school." Quote, the two women studied each other across the small office. Morrison represented the career military officer, competent, dedicated, but constrained by institutional loyalty and chain of command thinking. Eleanor represented something more fluid and potentially dangerous, expertise without institutional allegiance. "I'm here to do a job," Eleanor said finally, "same as everyone else." "No, you're not." Morrison opened the file and began reading. "Major Eleanor Mitchell, 18th Combat Support Hospital. 15 years active duty. Multiple combat deployments. Trauma surgery certification and enough commendations to wallpaper this office." She looked up. "That person doesn't get assigned to count clipboards at a training base." Eleanor remained silent, letting Morrison draw her own conclusions. "You're auditing us," Morrison continued. "Someone upstairs thinks this base has problems, and they sent you to document them." Her voice dropped slightly. "The question is, what did you find?" "What do you think I found?" Morrison leaned back in her chair, her expression growing troubled. "I think you found exactly what you were sent to find. Operational deficiencies, safety violations, and a command structure more interested in protecting egos than maintaining standards. And what are you going to do about it?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Morrison could report this conversation to her superiors, potentially ending her career but maintaining her loyalty to the institutional chain of command. Or she could acknowledge what they both knew to be true, that the base's medical operations had become dangerously compromised by a culture of arrogance and willful ignorance. "I'm going to give you 36 hours, Morrison said finally. "Whatever you're planning, whatever authority you're operating under, I'm going to assume it's legitimate and look the other way. But after that, I have to protect my people and my command." Eleanor nodded once. 36 hours should be sufficient. As she left Morrison's office, Eleanor realized that the endgame was accelerating faster than she'd anticipated. Her cover was blown, at least among the senior staff, but that might actually work to her advantage. Sometimes the best way to spring a trap was to let your targets know it was closing around them. She had 36 hours to document the final evidence she needed, and she had a growing suspicion that the base's next major crisis would provide exactly the opportunity she was waiting for. The desert wind picked up as she walked across the darkened tarmac, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and the distant sound of aircraft engines being tested. Somewhere in that routine noise was the sound of a reckoning approaching. The emergency began with routine patrol monitoring that quickly escalated into a crisis no one had seen coming. A convoy had been hit by multiple IEDs and was now taking heavy fire from insurgents who had apparently been waiting in ambush. Reports indicated at least 15 severely wounded personnel, with more casualties expected as the firefight continued. The nearest combat hospital was 40 minutes away by helicopter, time that many of the wounded simply didn't have. Forward Operating Base Horizon received the emergency call at 0630 hours. Every available medical team was needed immediately for an emergency field deployment that would push both personnel and equipment to their absolute limits. There was just one problem. Most of the base's senior medical staff were either in maintenance cycles or already deployed on training missions. The few experienced trauma specialists who remained were experiencing the same personnel shortages that had plagued the base for weeks. In the operations center, Captain Morrison coordinated frantically with regional command, while Lieutenant Briggs attempted to assemble whatever resources remained available. The mathematics were grim. They had barely enough qualified personnel to reach the wounded, assuming everything went perfectly, which given recent training performance seemed increasingly unlikely. "We need every qualified medical officer we can get," Morrison announced to the assembled teams. "This is not a drill, people. Lives are depending on us getting this right." From the back of the briefing room, Eleanor spoke up. "I'm available." The room went silent. Briggs turned slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and calculation. "Mitchell, you're not certified on any of our field procedures," he said with barely controlled frustration. "This is a combat rescue mission, not a logistics exercise." "I'm certified on everything in this facility," she replied calmly, "including advanced trauma surgery that everyone assumes I don't practice anymore." Morrison consulted her personnel roster, confusion evident in her voice. "Mitchell, your file shows you're assigned to—" "My file shows what it needs to show," Eleanor interrupted. "But right now, soldiers are going to die if we don't get more qualified hands in the field. I can be ready in 5 minutes." The debate that followed was heated but brief. With lives hanging in the balance and resources stretched to breaking point, even institutional prejudices had to give way to practical necessity. Morrison made the decision that would change everything. "Mitchell, you're cleared for emergency field operations. Coordinate with flight lead on evacuation protocols." Briggs opened his mouth to protest, but Morrison cut him off with a look that could have frozen jet fuel. Eleanor was already moving toward the equipment room before the authorization was complete. She'd been preparing for this moment since her arrival, mentally rehearsing every procedure and emergency protocol for the kind of mass casualty situation they were about to face. The medical kit she assembled was different from the standard issue, modified based on her extensive field experience in situations where conventional approaches often failed. As she ran through her pre-deployment checks with practiced efficiency, Eleanor could hear the helicopters spinning up around her. Radio chatter filled the air as crews coordinated their approach to the combat zone, their voices tense with the knowledge that this was no longer a training exercise. Corporal Torres appeared at her side, his face grim with concern. "Ma'am, the combat reports are getting worse. Heavy weapons fire near the extraction zone, visibility compromised by smoke, and the insurgents are using the wounded as bait for secondary ambushes." He handed her an updated tactical report. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor glanced at the data, mentally calculating the treatment parameters she'd need to navigate the dangerous conditions: multiple trauma types, limited supplies, constant threat of additional casualties, and terrain that left no margin for error. It was exactly the kind of situation that separated qualified surgeons from pretenders. "I'm sure," she said, strapping on her tactical vest. "Clear the landing zone." The helicopters lifted off with a precision that surprised even the experienced ground crews watching from the flight line. While the other medical teams struggled with coordination and radio protocols, Eleanor's focus was absolute, mentally preparing for every possible injury scenario they might encounter. In the operations center, Morrison watched the multiple aircraft tracks converge on the emergency site. Radio communications crackled with updates as the rescue mission began in earnest, but increasingly, one voice stood out above the chatter. Calm, professional, and utterly confident in conditions that were pushing the other medics to their limits. "Tower, this is MASH 1. Approaching insertion point. Multiple casualties visible from the air. Establishing triage protocols before touchdown." It was Mitchell, navigating dangerous conditions with the assurance of someone who had done this many times before. The real test was about to begin. The landing zone was a nightmare when Eleanor's helicopter touched down. Smoke rose in thick columns from the destroyed vehicles, while sporadic gunfire continued in the distance. Through her headset, she could hear the other aircraft struggling with the conditions, altitude corrections, course changes, and increasingly frustrated radio traffic as crews found themselves unable to establish secure perimeters. "This is Alpha Leader." Briggs's voice came over the radio, tight with tension. "Taking fire at our position. Visibility compromised by smoke. Request permission to abort current approach. Alpha Leader Tower. You are cleared to abort and establish holding pattern at safe distance." One by one, the other helicopters pulled back from the hot zone, their medics citing legitimate safety concerns about operating in conditions that exceeded their training parameters. The massive rescue mission was reduced to a skeleton crew. Eleanor's team and a handful of others who had managed to land before the situation deteriorated further. "Tower, this is MASH 1. Eleanor's voice came through the radio with mechanical calm. "We have multiple critical casualties. Establishing field surgical station now." In the operations center, Morrison found herself holding her breath as she watched the lone medical team symbol remain deep in the danger zone on her display screen. Everything they'd been taught about combat safety argued against what Mitchell was attempting. But wounded soldiers hung in the balance, and conventional wisdom had already failed. MASH 1. Be advised, hostile activity is extreme in your sector. Recommend immediate extraction with current casualties. Tower, I'm committed to treatment. Beginning emergency surgery now. The radio went silent except for the sound of occasional gunfire in the background. On the ground, Eleanor had established a makeshift operating theater behind the minimal cover of a bombed-out building. The wounded soldiers had been triaged, 4 requiring immediate life-saving interventions, 8 with serious but stable injuries, and 3 walking wounded who were helping to secure the perimeter. "I need a clear field and steady hands," she told the medics who had landed with her. "Anyone who can't handle working under fire should evacuate with the next helicopter." No one moved. Something in her calm authority had transformed their fear into focused determination. Eleanor began operating on the first casualty, a young sergeant with multiple shrapnel wounds and a partially severed femoral artery. The injury would have been challenging in a fully equipped hospital. In the field, with sporadic gunfire still echoing around them, it seemed almost impossible. Her hands moved with practiced precision, finding the damaged artery and clamping it before blood loss became fatal. She worked with an economy of motion that spoke of thousands of similar procedures performed under equally dire circumstances. "Pressure holding, blood pressure stabilizing," quote, reported the medic assisting her. "How did you isolate that artery so quickly?" "Experience," Eleanor replied simply, already moving to close the wound. Next patient. The second casualty presented an even greater challenge, a soldier with a chest wound that had collapsed his lung and was causing pressure on his heart. Conventional field medicine dictated evacuation to a proper surgical facility, but the ongoing firefight made immediate extraction impossible. The soldier wouldn't survive the weight. Eleanor made a decision that went against every field medicine protocol. "I'm going to perform a thoracotomy. Right here, right now." The medics exchanged nervous glances. The procedure, opening the chest cavity to directly access the heart and lungs, was rarely attempted outside fully equipped operating rooms, let alone in a combat zone with bullets still flying overhead. "Ma'am, the protocols don't," one of them began. "The protocols will get him killed," Eleanor cut in. "Prepare the field." What followed was a masterclass in combat surgery. Working with limited equipment and under constant threat, Eleanor opened the soldier's chest, manually reinflated his collapsed lung, relieved the pressure around his heart, and controlled the bleeding from his internal injuries. Her movements were precise, decisive, without hesitation or doubt. As she worked, an explosion rocked their position, showering debris over the makeshift operating area. Eleanor didn't even look up, her concentration absolute, as she continued the delicate procedure. "Incoming!" shouted one of the perimeter guards. "They've spotted the medical station!" The medical team looked to Eleanor for direction, expecting her to order an immediate evacuation. Instead, she remained focused on her patient, her hands steady despite the imminent danger. "I need 2 more minutes to close," she said calmly. "Anyone who wants to leave should go now. I'm staying with my patient." No one moved. Her courage had become contagious. As small arms fire began impacting closer to their position, Eleanor completed the procedure and closed the chest cavity. The patient was stabilized. Against all odds and conventional medical wisdom, she had performed open chest surgery in the middle of an active firefight. "Tower, this is MASH 1, she radioed. 4 critical patients stabilized and ready for immediate evacuation. Request extraction under fire protocols." The response came not from the tower, but from a voice they all recognized. "MASH 1, this is Alpha Lead. We're inbound for hot extraction. Hold your position." It was Briggs, bringing his medical team back into the danger zone after witnessing Eleanor's refusal to abandon her patients. The evacuation that followed was textbook perfect, despite the challenging conditions. All wounded personnel were loaded aboard the incoming helicopters, while Eleanor's surgical team provided covering fire. As the last patient was secured, Eleanor performed a final check of the area to ensure no one was left behind. That's when the sniper's bullet found her. The impact knocked Eleanor backward, a sharp burning sensation erupting across her left shoulder. Through the haze of sudden pain, her surgeon's mind clinically identified the injury. Through-and-through wound, likely missed the subclavian artery given the lack of catastrophic bleeding, but tissue damage would be significant. Survivable, if treated properly. "Mitchell's hit!" Torres shouted, rushing to her side as she struggled to remain upright. Eleanor gritted her teeth against the pain. "It's not critical. Complete the evacuation." "Not without you," Torres insisted, already applying pressure to the wound. Another burst of gunfire erupted nearby, sending everyone diving for cover. The extraction helicopters were hovering just beyond the landing zone, rotors kicking up dust that provided some concealment but making visibility nearly impossible. "We need to move now." Briggs's voice cut through the chaos as he appeared beside them, medical kit in hand. Without hesitation, he applied a pressure bandage to Eleanor's shoulder, his movements surprisingly gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "Can you walk?" he asked, meeting her eyes directly for perhaps the first time. Eleanor nodded once, refusing to show weakness. "Just get our patients out first." "Already loaded," Briggs replied. "You're the last one." With Torres on one side and Briggs on the other, Eleanor made her way to the waiting helicopter. The pain in her shoulder intensified with each step, but she maintained her composure, focusing on the mission rather than her own injury. As they lifted off, Eleanor looked back at the makeshift surgical station, where she'd just performed life-saving procedures under impossible conditions. Blood, both her patients' and now her own, stained the dusty ground. The scene grew smaller as the helicopter gained altitude, eventually disappearing altogether as they banked toward base. In the cramped confines of the medical evacuation helicopter, Briggs began treating her wound with surprising competence, cutting away her uniform to reveal the extent of the injury. "Clean entry and exit," he reported, relief evident in his voice. "Missed the major vessels." "I could have told you that," Eleanor replied, the edges of her vision beginning to blur as the adrenaline wore off and shock began to set in. "I know you could have," Briggs said quietly, administering pain medication and continuing to dress the wound. "Just like you could have told us a lot of other things if we'd bothered to listen." The admission caught her off guard, more surprising than the bullet that had torn through her shoulder. Before she could respond, darkness crept into her peripheral vision, and she surrendered to unconsciousness. Eleanor awoke in the base medical facility, the familiar sounds of monitors and medical equipment creating a soothing backdrop to her disoriented thoughts. Her shoulder was immobilized, the dull throb of pain held at bay by what she recognized as high-grade military painkillers. "Welcome back, Major Mitchell," came a voice she didn't immediately recognize. Turning her head, Eleanor found herself looking at a man in full colonel's uniform sitting beside her bed. The insignia on his collar identified him as Medical Corps, and the tablet in his hand likely contained her complete military record. Colonel James Hartwick, Department of Defense Medical Inspector General's Office. He introduced himself. "You've had quite an eventful audit mission." Eleanor attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement sent fresh pain through her injured shoulder. "Easy, Major," Hartwick cautioned. "The bullet did more damage than you initially assessed. You'll need time to recover." "The casualties?" Eleanor asked, her priorities clear despite her condition. "All 17 survived, including the 4 you treated under fire." Hartwick's expression softened slightly. "Including the thoracotomy patient, which I understand defied every field medicine protocol in the book." "Protocols don't save lives, Colonel. Surgeons do." "That's precisely what I've come to discuss." Hartwick set the tablet on the bed tray. "Your audit findings were comprehensive and disturbing, even before yesterday's combat situation. But your actions during the emergency have transformed what would have been a routine command reassignment into something much more significant." Outside her room, Eleanor could see unusual activity in the medical wing. Officers she didn't recognize interviewing base personnel, reviewing records, and conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive inspection of the facility. "The department has initiated a full investigation of forward operating Base Horizon," Hartwick explained, following her gaze. Your documentation provided the foundation, but your field performance yesterday offered irrefutable proof of the systemic issues at play here. What happens now? Eleanor asked, her mind already calculating the political ramifications of such an intervention. Lieutenant Briggs has been relieved of his position pending investigation, Hartwick replied. Captain Morrison has been temporarily reassigned while we determine the extent of her awareness and involvement in the operational deficiencies. Eleanor frowned. Morrison was only beginning to recognize the problems. She gave me space to complete my audit. That will be taken into consideration, Hartwick assured her. But the failures here go beyond individual personnel. The entire command structure allowed a culture of exclusion and arrogance to develop, one that prioritized politics over medicine, conformity over competence. Through the window of her room, Eleanor caught sight of Corporal Torres speaking with one of the investigators, his expression serious as he presumably recounted his observations of the past weeks. Your injury has complicated matters, Hartwick continued. The original plan called for you to deliver your findings personally to the Pentagon Oversight Committee. Given your condition, that will have to wait. I can still testify, Eleanor insisted, attempting once more to sit up. This is too important to delay. Hartwick placed a restraining hand on her uninjured arm. The committee isn't going anywhere, Major. Your health comes first. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. To Eleanor's surprise, Lieutenant Briggs stood in the doorway, his uniform missing the command insignia she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Colonel, may I have a moment with Major Mitchell? He asked, his usual confidence replaced by something more subdued. Hartwick looked to Eleanor, who nodded her permission. 5 minutes, Lieutenant, the colonel said as he rose to leave. She needs her rest. When they were alone, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Briggs remained standing just inside the doorway, as if uncertain of his welcome. I suppose you're feeling vindicated, he finally said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. This was never about vindication, Briggs, Eleanor replied evenly. It was about patient safety and combat readiness. I know that now. He moved closer to her bed, his posture stiff with unaccustomed humility. The investigators found your journal, the one you kept hidden. Your observations were uncomfortably accurate. Eleanor said nothing, waiting for him to continue. You knew from the beginning what we were doing wrong, but instead of pulling rank or exposing us immediately, you tried to guide us toward better practices. Briggs shook his head. And we responded by isolating and mocking you. Ego is a powerful force in medicine, Eleanor observed. Sometimes more powerful than training or evidence. I watched you operate yesterday, Briggs said, his voice dropping. In the middle of a firefight, with minimal equipment and maximum pressure, I've never seen anything like it. He finally met her eyes directly. The soldier you performed the thoracotomy on, Harrison. He's my best friend from basic training. The surgeons at the combat hospital said he wouldn't have survived transport without your intervention. Eleanor felt the weight of his words, understanding that this wasn't just a professional acknowledgement, but a deeply personal one. Why didn't you tell us who you really were? Briggs asked. We would have listened if we'd known your credentials. Would you? Eleanor countered. Or would you have performed for the inspector without addressing the underlying issues? She shifted slightly, managing the pain in her shoulder. Real change doesn't come from fear of authority. It comes from recognizing the value of expertise, regardless of where it comes from. Briggs absorbed this, the truth of it evident in his expression. I've been recommended for reassignment to a combat support hospital in Germany, he said finally. The investigation determined that while I fostered a problematic culture, my clinical skills remain valuable. You're a good doctor, Briggs, Eleanor acknowledged. You just forgot that being good isn't the same as being right all the time. He nodded, accepting both the criticism and the underlying hope it contained. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for how we treated you, and I'm grateful that you were here yesterday when it mattered most. As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him, Lieutenant. When he looked back, she continued, "Sometimes our greatest growth comes from our most painful failures. Remember that, in Germany." After Briggs departed, Eleanor found herself alone with her thoughts, reviewing the events that had led to this moment. The audit had been necessary but insufficient. It had taken a crisis, real lives hanging in the balance, to demonstrate the true cost of the base's dysfunctional culture. Her reverie was interrupted by another visitor, Corporal Torres, carrying a small package under his arm. "The investigators asked me to bring this to you," he said, placing her journal on the bedside table. "They've finished documenting its contents." Eleanor regarded the worn notebook with mixed emotions. It contained not just her professional observations, but her personal reflections on the isolation and hostility she'd experienced. It was as much a diary as a medical record. "They're saying you're going to receive a commendation," Torres continued, pulling up the chair Colonel Hartwick had vacated. "The Silver Star, for performing surgery under enemy fire." "I wasn't thinking about medals," Eleanor replied. "I was thinking about patience." "That's why you deserve it," Torres said simply. He hesitated before adding, "They've offered me a position on the Inspector General's investigative team. Said my observations during your audit showed exceptional perception and integrity." Eleanor smiled, genuinely pleased. "You were the first to see beyond the facade, Torres. That kind of insight is rare and valuable." "I learned it from watching you," he admitted. "The way you observed everything without judgment, documented without emotion, but still cared enough to act when lives were at stake." The base intercom system interrupted their conversation, announcing the arrival of additional investigative personnel and calling for all department heads to report for interviews. The systematic dismantling of Forward Operating Base Horizon's command structure was continuing at a pace that suggested high-level interest in the findings. "You've started something significant," Torres observed. "The ripples from this investigation are already spreading to other bases. Command is re-evaluating medical protocols across the entire theater of operations." Eleanor considered this with cautious optimism. Institutional change was notoriously difficult in military medicine, where tradition often outweighed innovation and hierarchy sometimes stifled progress. Yet her experience had demonstrated that when properly motivated, especially by documented evidence of failure, even the most entrenched systems could be reformed. "Change was overdue," she said finally. Too many good doctors were being silenced by a culture that valued conformity over competence. Torres rose to leave, understanding that she needed rest. "The medical team is already different," he noted. This morning's briefing included open discussion of treatment options, with junior personnel encouraged to challenge assumptions if they had evidence to support their concerns. As he reached the door, he turned back with a final thought. "You knew you might get shot, didn't you? When you refused to evacuate with the others." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I knew it was a possibility. But I also knew those soldiers would die without immediate surgical intervention." "That's what leadership looks like," Torres said quietly. "Not giving orders, but being willing to risk everything for the mission when it truly matters." After Torres departed, Eleanor drifted in and out of sleep, her body demanding rest to heal the trauma it had endured. Her dreams were a mixture of operating room procedures and battlefield chaos, the lines between them blurring in her subconscious. She awakened to find Captain Morrison standing at the foot of her bed, her expression a complex mixture of professional respect and personal regret. "I thought you should know," Morrison began without preamble. "The investigation has cleared me of direct responsibility for the operational deficiencies. I'm being reassigned to Camp Liberty to implement the new medical protocols your audit has inspired." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised by this development. Morrison had been complicit through inaction, rather than deliberate malfeasance, a common failing in military leadership, but one that could be remedied with proper guidance. "You gave me the 36 hours I asked for," Eleanor acknowledged. "That counts for something." Morrison moved closer, lowering her voice despite the privacy of the room. "I've been in the service for 18 years, Mitchell. I've seen commanders come and go, policies change and revert, reform efforts rise and fall, but I've never seen anything like what you accomplished here." "What do you mean?" "You didn't just document failures or expose incompetence. You demonstrated a better way forward, not through presentations or policy papers, but through direct action when lives were on the line." Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "The reports say you performed open chest surgery while taking enemy fire, using techniques that aren't even taught in our current field medicine curriculum. Sometimes the situation demands more than the protocol allows," Eleanor replied. That's the point, Morrison insisted. Your audit wasn't just about what we were doing wrong. It was about what's possible when we set aside ego and institutional constraints and focus entirely on the mission. Eleanor hadn't considered her actions in such philosophical terms. She'd simply done what was necessary to save lives, drawing on experience that most military surgeons never had the opportunity to acquire. The Oversight Committee is recommending a complete revision of our field surgery protocols, Morrison continued. They want you to lead the development team once you've recovered. The offer was unexpected but intriguing. Eleanor had spent years operating within a system that often limited her ability to implement the techniques she knew could save lives. The opportunity to reshape that system from within was compelling. I'll consider it, she said finally. Morrison nodded, satisfied with this response. For what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't recognize sooner what was happening on my base. I was so focused on maintaining the command structure that I missed the deterioration of our medical standards. That's the challenge of leadership, Eleanor observed. Balancing respect for authority with the courage to question when necessary. As Morrison prepared to leave, she paused at the door. The soldier you operated on, Specialist Harrison, he's being transferred to Walter Reed tomorrow. The surgeons there want to study what you did. They're calling it the Mitchell procedure, emergency thoracotomy under combat conditions. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. The same medical establishment that had deemed her unfit for advanced battlefield deployment was now studying her techniques as the new standard for combat surgery. Later that evening, as the base settled into an uneasy new routine under the watchful eyes of the investigative team, Colonel Hartwick returned with formal paperwork requiring her signature. Your official statement on the events of yesterday, he explained, placing the documents on her tray table. I've also included the preliminary findings from your audit, which require your verification before submission to the Congressional Oversight Committee. Eleanor reviewed the papers carefully, noting that her observations had been documented without alteration or political softening. The truth was laid bare: the systematic exclusion of qualified input, the dismissal of safety concerns, the prioritization of ego over evidence. One more thing, Hartwick added, producing a final document. The Surgeon General has requested your transfer to the Combat Medicine Innovation Division once you've recovered. You'd have oversight of field procedure development across all branches. Eleanor looked up from the papers, surprised by the rapid evolution of events. That's a significant promotion, Colonel. It's a necessary one, Hartwick replied. What happened here at Horizon isn't isolated, Major. We've identified similar patterns at 3 other forward operating bases. The culture that dismissed your expertise exists throughout the system. The implications were sobering. If other bases were operating with the same dangerous combination of arrogance and inadequate protocols, countless lives were at risk. The transfer is voluntary, Hartwick continued. You've certainly earned a less demanding position after this mission, but the Surgeon General believes your unique combination of technical skill and moral courage makes you ideally suited to lead this reform effort. Quote, Eleanor considered the offer, weighing her desire for meaningful change against the personal cost such a position would entail. Combat medicine was notoriously resistant to innovation, with institutional inertia reinforced by the hierarchy of military rank. Yet her experience at Forward Operating Base Horizon had demonstrated that change was possible when the evidence was irrefutable and the stakes were made clear. Her unorthodox thoracotomy had saved a life that conventional protocols would have sacrificed. That single case study might open doors that years of committee meetings could not. I'll take the position, she decided, on one condition. Hartwick raised an eyebrow. Which is? I want Corporal Torres assigned to my team, along with any other personnel who demonstrated the courage to question established practices during my audit. Recruiting your own reform squad? Hartwick asked with a hint of amusement. Building a team that values expertise over rank, Eleanor corrected. If we're going to change the culture of combat medicine, we need voices from every level of the system. Hartwick considered this, then nodded his agreement. I'll make the arrangements. As he gathered the signed paperwork, he offered a final observation. You know, the irony of all this is that if they hadn't labeled you unfit and sent you here as an undercover auditor, none of these reforms would be happening. Eleanor smiled slightly. Sometimes being deemed unfit by a broken system is the highest compliment possible, Colonel. The following morning, as she was being prepared for transfer to the regional military hospital, Eleanor received one last visitor, Specialist Williams, the medic who had assisted during her impromptu field surgery. "They told me you're leaving, ma'am," he said, standing awkwardly at the foot of her bed. "I wanted to thank you before you went." "For what, Specialist?" "For showing us what's possible." Williams moved closer, his expression earnest. "I've been a combat medic for 6 years. I've followed every protocol, memorized every procedure, but yesterday, watching you operate under fire using techniques I'd never seen before, it changed everything I thought I knew about field medicine." Eleanor understood the transformation he was describing. It was the difference between practicing medicine according to the manual and recognizing when the manual itself needed to be rewritten. "The best protocols are those that leave room for expertise and judgment, Williams," she said. "Remember that, whatever comes next." "That's just it, ma'am. I've been accepted to medical school through the Military Advancement Program. I start next fall." His expression grew determined. "I want to become the kind of doctor who knows when to follow protocol and when to transcend it." As the medical transport team arrived to move her to the waiting helicopter, Eleanor reflected on the unexpected ripple effects of her audit mission. She had come to document failures, but in the process had inspired a new generation of military medical personnel to question, innovate, and prioritize patient outcomes over procedural conformity. The stretcher carrying her was loaded into the waiting helicopter, the same one that had extracted her from the battlefield just 24 hours earlier. As the rotors began to spin, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of forward operating base horizon through the window. The medical tents, the operations center, the training facilities where she had been systematically excluded and dismissed. The base was already transforming under the oversight team's direction, old patterns disrupted, new protocols being established. The change had come at a high cost. Her own injury, the risk to patients, the careers derailed by the investigation, but the alternative would have been far worse. As the helicopter lifted off, banking toward the horizon, Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The system that had labeled her unfit was being reformed according to standards she would help establish. The expertise that had been dismissed was now being studied as the new benchmark for combat medicine. Sometimes the strongest voices were indeed the ones that the old guard tried hardest to silence. Sometimes the most crucial innovations came from those who refused to accept that the established way was the only way. And sometimes, as Eleanor Mitchell had proven under enemy fire with nothing but skill and courage to guide her, being deemed unfit by a flawed system was merely the first step toward redefining what excellence truly meant. The helicopter banked toward the setting sun, carrying her toward a future where courage and competence would be valued above conformity, where protocols would serve patients rather than institutions, and where the next generation of combat surgeons would learn that sometimes saving lives required the courage to transcend the very rules designed to guide them. 3 months after the events at Forward Operating Base Horizon, the Walter Reed Military Medical Center's Surgical Innovation Wing buzzed with an energy that defied the typical bureaucratic atmosphere of military installations. At its center stood Colonel Eleanor Mitchell, her left arm showing only slight stiffness from the bullet wound that had nearly ended her career and her life. The rehabilitation had been grueling, pushing her body to recover full range of motion in her shoulder while simultaneously navigating the political complexities of her new position. The promotion had come with the Senate confirmation hearing, transforming the undercover auditor into the public face of combat medicine reform across all military branches. "Colonel, the simulation results just came in," announced Captain Torres, formerly corporal, now her right-hand officer in the Combat Medicine Innovation Division. His promotion had raised eyebrows among traditionalists, but Eleanor had insisted on building her team based on merit rather than time served. "Let's see them," she replied, turning toward the large display screen dominating the conference room wall. The data flowing across the screen represented 6 weeks of rigorous testing, the Mitchell Protocol for emergency thoracic surgery under combat conditions, versus the standard field procedures that had been in place for decades. The results were unequivocal. Survival rates increased by 43% across all simulated scenarios, Torres reported, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. Most significantly, in the high-threat limited-resource environments where traditional evacuation isn't possible. Eleanor studied the numbers with clinical detachment, but beneath her professional exterior, A sense of vindication flowed through her. The techniques she'd pioneered, the same ones that had been dismissed as reckless and outside protocol by her former superiors, were proving demonstrably superior when lives hung in the balance. Forward these results to the Surgeon General's office, she instructed, and prepare briefing packets for the Joint Chiefs. We'll need their full support before implementation. As Torres left to execute her instructions, Eleanor remained alone with the data, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The hostile reception at Forward Operating Base Horizon now seemed like a distant memory, though one that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of military medicine. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. James Harlow, Walter Reed's chief of surgery and initially one of the most vocal critics of her protocols, stood in the doorway with an expression that suggested he was still coming to terms with the changing reality of combat medicine. "Your team's results are impressive, Colonel," he acknowledged, entering without waiting for an invitation. "Though I maintain that some of these procedures carry inherent risks that cannot be fully mitigated in field conditions." Eleanor had grown accustomed to this kind of qualified acceptance. The old guard rarely surrendered completely to new methodologies, preferring instead to hedge their endorsements with professional cautions. "All surgery carries inherent risks, Dr. Harlow," she replied evenly. "The question is whether those risks outweigh the certainty of mortality if we adhere to protocols designed for conditions that no longer reflect battlefield realities." Harlow frowned slightly. "You've made that point repeatedly in your presentations. I'm not here to rehash old arguments." "Then why are you here?" "Because the Joint Surgical Conference has requested your presence as keynote speaker next month," he said, the words clearly difficult for him to deliver. "The committee feels your field innovations should be presented directly to the international surgical community." The invitation represented more than professional recognition. It was an acknowledgement that the military medical establishment was finally ready to evolve beyond the constraints that had limited battlefield surgery for generations. "I'll prepare a presentation," Eleanor agreed. "Will you be attending?" "As outgoing chairman, I'll be introducing you," Harlow admitted, his expression suggesting this wasn't entirely his choice. The committee felt it would demonstrate the unified support of the surgical leadership. Eleanor suppressed a smile. Politics remained politics. Even in medicine, Harlow's introduction would effectively tie his reputation to the success of her protocols, a clever maneuver by whoever had orchestrated it. "I look forward to your introduction, Doctor," she said diplomatically. After Harlow departed, Eleanor returned to the simulation data, noting aspects that still required refinement. Her protocols weren't perfect. No medical procedure ever was. But they represented a fundamental shift in thinking about what was possible in combat conditions. Her office phone rang, interrupting her analysis. "Colonel Mitchell," she answered crisply. "Colonel, this is General Westfield from Central Command." The voice carried the weight of authority that only came with stars on one's shoulders. "I've just reviewed your simulation results." Eleanor steeled herself for resistance. Westfield was known as a traditionalist who valued established procedures over innovation. "The numbers speak for themselves, General," she replied. "Yes, they do," he agreed, surprising her. "Which is why I'm calling. We have a situation developing in the Khovar region that requires your expertise." Eleanor straightened in her chair. "What kind of situation?" "A forward surgical team is encountering complex trauma cases beyond their training parameters. The regional instability makes conventional evacuation increasingly problematic." Westfield paused. "In simple terms, Colonel, soldiers are dying because the surgical teams don't have your skills or protocols." The implications were clear. Despite the promising simulation results, the Mitchell protocols were not yet standard practice throughout combat theaters. Surgeons were still bound by outdated procedures that prioritized evacuation over immediate intervention, the same approach that would have cost lives during her audit mission. "You want me to deploy to Khovar," she concluded. "Not just you," Westfield clarified. "I want your entire innovation team on the ground, implementing your protocols and training the forward surgical units in real time. Consider it a field trial under actual combat conditions." The request was unprecedented, sending a research team directly into a combat zone to implement experimental protocols. Yet it also represented the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of her methods beyond simulations and controlled studies. "We'll need full operational authority," Eleanor stipulated. "No interference from the existing command structure." "You'll report directly to me," Westfield assured her. The base commanders have been notified that your team will have complete autonomy in all medical matters. After concluding the call, Eleanor sat motionless, absorbing the magnitude of what had just been proposed. 3 months ago, she had been an undercover auditor, isolated and dismissed by the very system she was trying to improve. Now she was being handed the authority to transform combat medicine directly on the battlefield. She pressed the intercom button on her desk. "Captain Torres, assemble the team for immediate briefing. We're deploying to Kovar. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The C-17 Globemaster III touched down at Forward Operating Base Artemis under the cover of darkness, its massive form silhouetted against the stars that dominated the Kovar night sky. As the rear ramp lowered, Eleanor led her team of 12 specialized medical personnel onto foreign soil, each carrying equipment specifically designed for the Mitchell protocols. Base Commander Colonel Frank Shepard waited at the edge of the tarmac, his expression a mixture of skepticism and desperation that Eleanor had come to recognize in senior officers confronted with her unorthodox methods. "Colonel Mitchell," he greeted her with a stiff salute. "Welcome to FOB Artemis. I understand you're here to revolutionize our surgical capabilities." The slight emphasis on revolutionize betrayed his reservations, but Eleanor chose to ignore the subtle challenge. "We're here to save lives, Colonel Shepard," she replied simply. "I'll need a complete briefing on your current medical operations and casualty statistics. Of course, we've prepared the Tactical Operations Center for your arrival." As they walked toward the central compound, Eleanor noted the similarities between FOB Artemis and Horizon. The same controlled chaos, the same hierarchy evident in every interaction, the same tension between procedural adherence and battlefield necessity. Only here, the stakes were higher. This wasn't a training exercise or an audit. It was an active combat zone where decisions translated directly into lives saved or lost. The briefing was sobering. In the past month, the forward surgical team had treated 47 critical casualties with a mortality rate approaching 30%, significantly higher than the statistical baseline for comparable facilities. The primary challenges involved complex thoracic and vascular traumas that exceeded the team's training parameters, combined with evacuation delays caused by enemy activity. "Show me your surgical facility," Eleanor requested after absorbing the data. The medical unit was well equipped by forward deployment standards, with 2 functional operating theaters, modern monitoring equipment, and adequate supplies. What it lacked wasn't resources but methodology. The surgeons were capable but constrained by protocols that hadn't evolved to match the realities of modern asymmetric warfare. Major Sandra Phillips, the unit's chief surgeon, met them at the entrance to the surgical wing. Her expression carried the weariness of someone who had lost too many patients despite her best efforts. "Colonel Mitchell." She greeted Eleanor with genuine respect. "Your thoracotomy procedure saved 3 of my classmates during their deployments. We've been trying to replicate your techniques, but without formal training." "That's why we're here, Major," Eleanor assured her. "We'll implement a complete protocol transition, beginning with hands-on training for your surgical teams." Phillips's relief was palpable. "When do we start?" "Now," Eleanor replied. "Walk me through your next scheduled procedure." The surgical slate included 4 cases from a recent convoy ambush, all stable but requiring complex interventions within the next 12 hours. Eleanor reviewed each file, noting where conventional protocols limited the surgical options available to Phillips's team. "We'll take the first case together," she decided. "Your team will observe the Mitchell protocol in action. Then we'll progressively integrate your surgeons into subsequent procedures." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first surgery, a complex aortic repair on a sergeant injured by shrapnel, became an impromptu masterclass in battlefield surgery. Eleanor's hands moved with practiced precision, demonstrating techniques that eliminated unnecessary steps while preserving critical safety margins. Captain Torres assisted, providing specialized instruments developed specifically for the Mitchell protocol, while narrating key procedural modifications for the observing surgical team. Conventional protocol would require temporary closure and evacuation at this stage, Eleanor explained as she approached the most critical portion of the repair. But that introduces unnecessary risks during transport and delays definitive treatment. Instead, she completed the complex vascular repair, using a technique she had developed during her combat deployments, one that maintained circulatory stability while allowing for complete resolution of the injury in a single procedure. Total time from incision to closure, 43 minutes, Torres announced as Eleanor placed the final suture. Conventional protocol estimated time to temporary closure would have been 38 minutes, followed by evacuation and a second procedure at the regional surgical center. The implications were clear. Not only had Eleanor completed the definitive repair in less time than a temporary intervention would have required, but she had eliminated the risks associated with transport and secondary surgery entirely. Major Phillips stared at the monitors displaying the patient's stable vital signs with something approaching reverence. "That's not possible according to everything I was taught." "That's precisely the point, Major," Eleanor replied as she removed her surgical gloves. "What we're taught often reflects institutional limitations rather than medical necessities." Over the next 72 hours, Eleanor's team worked alongside the base surgeons, systematically implementing the Mitchell protocols across all surgical services. Each case served as both a life-saving intervention and a training opportunity, with base personnel progressively taking larger roles as their confidence with the new techniques grew. The mortality rate began dropping immediately, from nearly 30% to under 15% in the first week, then further as the surgical teams gained proficiency. Cases that would have required evacuation were being definitively treated on site, reducing risks to patients and freeing up critical transportation resources. Word spread quickly throughout the theater of operations. Medical officers from neighboring bases began arriving to observe the procedures, returning to their units with modified protocols and renewed confidence in their ability to save lives under the most challenging conditions. By the third week, FOB Artemis had been transformed from a casualty processing point to a center of surgical excellence. The Mitchell protocols had been fully implemented, with the base's original surgical team now training others in the revolutionary techniques. On the 23rd day of their deployment, as Eleanor supervised a particularly challenging procedure being performed by Major Phillips, the base alert system activated with the distinctive tone that indicated incoming casualties. "Multiple critical traumas inbound," the surgical coordinator announced over the intercom. "Helicopter dust-off reports at least 8 priority cases, possibly more. ETA 4 minutes. Phillips looked up from her patient, alarm evident in her eyes. Under the old protocols, handling 8 critical cases simultaneously would have exceeded the unit's capabilities, forcing triage decisions that inevitably resulted in preventable deaths. "Complete your procedure, Major," Eleanor instructed calmly. "Captain Torres, activate the mass casualty protocol we established. All available surgical teams to their assigned stations." What followed was the true test of everything they had implemented over the past 3 weeks. As casualties began arriving, the victims of a complex ambush involving multiple IEDs, the surgical teams deployed according to the Mitchell protocol for mass casualty events. Instead of the traditional triage approach that categorized patients based on severity and available resources, Eleanor's system implemented parallel processing. Multiple surgical teams addressing critical injuries simultaneously, using standardized procedures that maximized efficiency without compromising care. Eleanor moved between operating theaters, providing guidance where needed, but increasingly finding that her intervention was unnecessary. The teams were functioning with a precision and confidence that reflected complete integration of her protocols. "Colonel," Torres called from the monitoring station that coordinated the multiple simultaneous procedures, "all 8 critical casualties are in treatment with stable preliminary indicators. Estimated mortality based on injury severity scores would have been at least 3 under conventional protocols." Eleanor nodded, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction as she watched Major Phillips performing a thoracotomy with the same assured movements that had once been Eleanor's alone. This was the true victory, not just lives saved today, but the countless future patients who would benefit from the transformation taking place. As the mass casualty event stabilized, Eleanor stepped outside the surgical unit for a moment of quiet reflection. The desert night was cool, the stars brilliant above FOB Artemis. 3 months ago, she had been fighting for recognition of her expertise. Now, she was witnessing the culmination of that struggle, a fundamental shift in how military medicine approached battlefield trauma. "Quite a transformation," observed a voice from the shadows. Eleanor turned to find Colonel Shepard approaching, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching awe. Your team just saved 8 lives that would have been lost under our previous protocols, he continued. I've been in military medicine for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened in there tonight. It's not about my team, Colonel, Eleanor corrected gently. It's about what happens when we allow expertise to transcend hierarchy and tradition. Shepard nodded slowly. The after-action reports have already been transmitted to Central Command. General Westfield is recommending immediate implementation of the Mitchell protocols across all forward surgical units. The validation should have felt triumphant, but Eleanor found herself thinking of the journey that had led to this moment. The dismissal she had endured, the bullet she had taken, the institutional resistance she had overcome. Success wasn't about personal vindication. It was about creating a legacy that would endure beyond her individual contributions. Implementation will require more than just new procedure manuals, she cautioned. It requires a cultural shift, a willingness to question established protocols when evidence suggests better approaches. That's the harder part, Shepard acknowledged. Changing minds is always more difficult than changing methods. The following morning, as Eleanor conducted rounds on the patients from the mass casualty event, she received an unexpected message. General Westfield was inbound for a personal inspection of the transformation at FOB Artemis. The general's arrival created the usual flurry of activity associated with high-ranking visitors, but Eleanor remained focused on her patients and the ongoing training of the surgical teams. When Westfield finally located her, she was reviewing case files with Major Phillips, rather than preparing for his inspection. Colonel Mitchell, he greeted her, seemingly unsurprised to find her engaged in clinical work rather than political preparation. I understand you've revolutionized combat surgery in less than a month. We've implemented evidence-based protocols that reflect battlefield realities, General, she replied diplomatically. The credit belongs to the surgical teams who had the courage to adapt. Westfield studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who had navigated military politics for decades. You're being modest, Colonel. What you've accomplished here has implications far beyond this deployment. He gestured for her to accompany him outside, away from the medical personnel focused on their duties. When they were alone, his tone shifted from formal to reflective. 3 months ago, you were fighting for recognition of your expertise, he observed. Now you're reshaping an entire branch of military medicine. That's quite a trajectory. It wouldn't have been possible without your authorization for this deployment, Eleanor acknowledged. True, but I'm not here just to congratulate you. Westfield's expression grew serious. The Joint Chiefs have reviewed your results, both here and from Walter Reed. They're establishing a new division, Combat Surgical Innovation, with direct reporting to the Surgeon General's office. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to this announcement than administrative restructuring. They want you to lead it, Colonel. Full autonomy, dedicated research facilities, and deployment authority across all theaters of operation. The offer represented everything she had fought for: institutional recognition of her methodologies, the authority to implement them without interference, and the resources to continue refining her approach to combat medicine. What about the resistance from traditional surgical leadership? She asked, thinking of Dr. Harlow and others who had initially opposed her protocols. That's the beauty of irrefutable results, Colonel, Westfield replied with a thin smile. When you reduce mortality by more than 50%, even the most entrenched traditionalists find it difficult to maintain their opposition. As they walked the perimeter of the base, Eleanor considered the offer and its implications. Leading the new division would mean stepping away from direct surgical practice to focus on implementation and policy, trading her scalpel for the broader influence of institutional leadership. I'll accept on one condition, she finally said. Westfield raised an eyebrow. Which is? That the division includes a forward deployment component, specialized surgical teams that can integrate with combat units anywhere in the world, implementing protocols in real time and adapting to emerging challenges. The general nodded slowly, keeping your hand in the field while directing from above. It's unorthodox, but then again, so is everything about your approach. Medicine doesn't advance from conference rooms, General. It advances from direct engagement with the problems we're trying to solve. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching helicopters, not the medical evacuation units they were accustomed to, but transport craft carrying the insignia of Central Command. Those would be your new team members, Westfield explained. I took the liberty of expediting the process. 30 of the most promising combat surgeons in the service, selected based on adaptability and expertise rather than rank or time served. Eleanor watched as the helicopters touched down, disgorging medical personnel carrying equipment cases emblazoned with a new insignia, a caduceus superimposed over a shield, with Combat Surgical Innovation Division encircling the design. "Your creation, Colonel," Westfield said with unexpected sincerity. "From being deemed unfit to founding a new approach to battlefield medicine in less than 6 months. I'd call that a remarkable journey." As Eleanor stepped forward to greet her new team, she reflected on the true nature of her achievement. It wasn't about personal vindication or professional recognition. It wasn't even about the innovative surgical techniques that now bore her name. It was about creating a system where expertise was valued over rank, where evidence trumped tradition, and where the measure of success was lives saved rather than protocols followed. She had transformed from an outsider labeled unfit to the architect of a new paradigm in combat medicine, not by seeking validation, but by demonstrating excellence when it mattered most. The new surgical team assembled before her represented the future she had fought to create, one where military medicine evolved based on battlefield realities rather than institutional convenience, where innovation was encouraged rather than suppressed, and where the courage to challenge established practices was recognized as essential to the mission. "Welcome to Combat Surgical Innovation," she greeted them. "You're here because you've demonstrated the ability to think beyond conventional parameters. Our mission is simple but challenging: to develop, implement, and continuously improve surgical protocols that save lives in the most demanding environments on Earth." As she outlined her vision for the division, Eleanor could see in their expressions the same dedication that had driven her through the darkest moments of her journey, the unwavering commitment to excellence that transcended personal ambition or institutional politics. Later that evening, as the new team began integrating with FOB Artemis's surgical unit, Eleanor found a quiet moment to call Captain Torres to her temporary office. "How does Deputy Director of Combat Surgical Innovation sound, Captain?" she asked without preamble. Torres blinked in surprise. "Are you offering me a promotion, Colonel?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to continue what we started," Eleanor clarified, "building a medical system that values expertise over convention and results over tradition." "Just like you did at Forward Operating Base Horizon," Torres observed, "when everyone said you were unfit." Eleanor smiled at the memory that now seemed so distant. Sometimes being deemed unfit by a flawed system is the first indication that you're exactly what that system needs. As FOB Artemis settled into its new role as the proving ground for combat surgical innovation, Eleanor Mitchell stood at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her personal journey. The protocols that bore her name would save countless lives across future conflicts, implemented by surgeons who would never know the full story of how they came to be, how a decorated combat surgeon labeled unfit had transformed battlefield medicine through a combination of technical brilliance and moral courage. The title that had once been used to dismiss her, unfit, had become the catalyst for a revolution in military medicine, proving that true fitness for leadership came not from conformity to established norms, but from the courage to challenge them when lives hung in the balance. In the operating theaters of FOB Artemis and beyond, that legacy would continue long after Colonel Eleanor Mitchell completed her remarkable journey from outsider to innovator, from the woman deemed unfit to the architect of a new standard of excellence in combat medicine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.